The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown, and I was standing outside them, watching through the glass as Dominic Travers gestured enthusiastically at slides I'd helped prepare. His new protégé, Cassandra Vale, sat at his right hand, nodding along like she'd authored every word. My absence from that table wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. I'm Anita Radley, and I'd spent 7 years at Capricorn Technologies building the infrastructure that kept our Enterprise Solutions division profitable. Not glamorous work, system architecture, client retention protocols, the unsexy backbone that made quarterly numbers possible. Dominic had joined as VP of Strategic Operations 18 months ago, arriving with an Ivy League pedigree and a vocabulary that made synergy sound like a war cry. Capricorn Technologies occupied 3 floors of a steel and glass tower that reflected clouds during the day and glowed like a lantern at night. The executive suite lived on the top floor, where carpet was thicker and coffee came in real mugs instead of disposable cups. I worked 1 floor down, in a corner office I'd earned through consistency rather than charisma. My team handled implementation, the unglamorous translation of strategy into reality. Dominic had made his priorities clear from day one. He wanted bold thinking, disruptive innovation, people who played chess while others played checkers. Cassandra Vale fit that mold perfectly. She'd transferred from our West Coast satellite office 6 months ago, trailing recommendations that praised her visionary approach and fearless ideation. She spoke in TED Talk cadences, favored minimalist blazers, and had never, to my knowledge, personally closed a client contract. The meeting I was excluded from concerned our biggest initiative of the year, the Titan Project, a comprehensive platform overhaul for our enterprise clients. I drafted the initial feasibility analysis, identified integration challenges, mapped resource allocation across 4 departments. But Dominic had called it incremental thinking during a leadership review. He wanted transformation, not maintenance. When the rejection email arrived, politely worded, copied to my direct supervisor, I felt the familiar sting of being passed over. But I read it 3 times, and by the 3rd pass, something shifted. The email referenced strategic direction sessions and senior stakeholder alignment. It positioned my exclusion as a scheduling conflict, a matter of focus allocation. Corporate speak for, you're not important enough. I printed the email and filed it in a folder I'd started keeping 2 months earlier, after Dominic had reassigned one of my longest-running client accounts to Cassandra's oversight. Documentation wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. That afternoon, I attended a routine operations sync with my team. We reviewed system performance metrics, discussed an upcoming deployment window, resolved a minor vendor dispute. Ordinary work that kept revenue flowing. As we wrapped up, my lead engineer, Foster Yates, lingered by the door. "Saw you weren't in the Titan meeting," he said carefully. "Scheduling conflict," I replied, echoing the official line. Foster had been with Capricorn longer than I had, back when the company was a scrappy startup surviving on government contracts. He understood institutional memory. Cassandra stopped by earlier asking about the legacy integration protocols. Seemed surprised they were complicated. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Happy to support however needed. He studied me for a moment, then left. I turned back to my computer and opened the shared drive where Titan project documentation lived. My access permissions were still active, an oversight, probably, or maybe Dominic assumed I'd be too demoralized to pay attention. I started reading. Cassandra's strategic vision, as outlined in 17 slides of aspirational language, proposed a complete rebuild of our core platform. New architecture, new frameworks, aggressive timelines that would deliver revolutionary client experiences within 8 months. It looked impressive in presentation format, clean diagrams, confident projections, buzzwords that promised transformation. It also ignored 3 critical constraints I'd documented in my original feasibility analysis. First, our largest enterprise clients, accounting for 40% of division revenue, operated on systems that couldn't support the proposed architecture without 18 months of preparation. Second, our development team was already allocated to contractual obligations that couldn't be delayed without penalty clauses triggering. Third, the regulatory compliance requirements for our financial services clients made rapid platform changes legally complicated. Cassandra's plan mentioned none of this. It assumed a blank slate, as if Capricorn's existing obligations and client relationships could be politely set aside while we pursued innovation. I scrolled to the implementation timeline. Aggressive didn't begin to cover it. The plan called for initial deployment in 3 months, with full rollout by month 8. My team's resource allocation showed us stretched across multiple workstreams simultaneously, with no buffer for the inevitable complications that accompanied major system changes. I opened a new document and began taking notes. Not a formal rebuttal, nothing that would position me as obstructionist. Just observations, framed as implementation considerations. Question marks instead of criticisms. I saved the document in my personal drive, not the shared system. The next morning, Dominic's assistant scheduled an all-hands meeting for the following week. Subject line, Titan Project Launch Celebration. The word celebration struck me as premature, but confidence was Dominic's brand. He led with conviction, and in corporate environments, conviction often mattered more than accuracy. I spent the next few days maintaining my regular workflow while monitoring Titan project communications. Cassandra sent frequent updates to the leadership group, each one radiating optimism about stakeholder alignment and resource mobilization. Dominic replied with enthusiastic affirmations, occasionally adding his own flourishes about Capricorn's position as an industry leader. None of the updates mentioned client readiness assessments or technical dependency mapping, the foundational work that preceded successful platform transitions. It was all vision, no foundation. On Thursday afternoon, I received a calendar invitation from Walter Ingham, our Chief Operating Officer. 30-minute meeting, subject, Q3 Operations Review. Walter rarely scheduled one-on-ones with division directors unless something needed attention. I accepted the invitation and wondered if Dominic had complained about my absence from the strategy sessions. The meeting happened Friday morning in Walter's office, which occupied a corner of the executive floor with views in 2 directions. Walter had built Capricorn from a 12-person operation to a mid-market enterprise provider. He understood both the aspirational language that won contracts and the operational discipline that fulfilled them. Anita, he began, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I wanted to touch base about the Titan project. I settled into the chair, keeping my posture open and expression neutral. Happy to discuss. Dominic's excited about the strategic direction, Walter continued. Cassandra's brought some fresh perspectives. But I'm looking at the implementation timeline and wondering about resource feasibility. This was the opening. Not a complaint, not criticism, just a question from someone who'd seen enough failed launches to recognize warning signs. The vision is ambitious, I said carefully. There are some implementation considerations that might benefit from additional planning. Such as? I'd prepared for this conversation without knowing it would happen. Client readiness is the primary factor. Our enterprise accounts have complex technical environments. A platform transition of this scope requires preparation time we haven't built into the current timeline. Walter listened without interrupting as I walked through the constraints, contractual obligations, regulatory requirements, resource allocation conflicts. I kept my tone factual, avoiding any suggestion that Cassandra or Dominic had overlooked these factors maliciously. Oversight, not sabotage. Have you raised these concerns with Dominic? Walter asked. I wasn't included in the strategy sessions, I replied. But I'm happy to provide implementation analysis if it would be useful. Walter's expression didn't change, but he made a note on the pad in front of him. Put together a memo. Technical assessment, not strategic commentary. I'll make sure it gets reviewed before we finalize resource commitments. I thanked him and left, feeling the careful balance I was walking. Too aggressive, and I'd be labeled as obstructionist, someone clinging to old methods out of ego or fear. Too passive, and I'd watch a preventable disaster unfold. The memo would be my insurance policy, documentation that I'd raised concerns through appropriate channels before problems became crises. I spent the weekend drafting the document. 6 pages, meticulously footnoted, organized around 3 sections: client technical readiness, resource allocation analysis, and regulatory compliance timeline. Each section opened with an acknowledgement of the strategic vision's merit, then detailed the practical steps required to achieve it safely. I framed every constraint as solvable with proper planning, not as a reason to abandon the initiative. Monday morning, I sent the memo to Walter with a brief cover note thanking him for the opportunity to contribute. I didn't copy Dominic or Cassandra. Walter had requested the analysis, and organizational hierarchy meant he'd distribute it as he saw fit. The all-hands meeting happened that afternoon. Dominic stood at the front of our largest conference room, Cassandra beside him, both of them radiating the confidence of people announcing a victory. The presentation walked through Titan Project's transformational vision, reimagined client experiences, streamlined operations, market-leading innovation. The timeline graphic showed a clean arc from conception to deployment, complications nowhere in sight. "This is how Capricorn competes," Dominic declared, his voice carrying the cadence of practiced public speaking. "Not by incremental improvements, but by bold reimagination. Cassandra's vision represents the future of enterprise solutions." Applause rippled through the room. Cassandra smiled graciously, accepting congratulations from nearby colleagues. I clapped along with everyone else, observing the performance. After the meeting, I returned to my office and continued my regular work. Foster stopped by again, this time closing the door behind him. "That timeline's impossible," he said flatly. "It's ambitious," I replied. "Anita, we can't rebuild the core platform and maintain current client obligations simultaneously. Not without doubling the team, and we don't have budget for that." I met his eyes. "I've documented the concerns. Submitted them to Walter this morning." Foster relaxed slightly. "Good. Because if this goes sideways, I don't want my team blamed for execution failures when the problem is planning." "Understood," I said. "Keep records of resource requests and timeline conflicts." "Just normal project documentation." He nodded and left. I turned back to my screen, where my calendar showed the next 3 months packed with overlapping deliverables. If Titan Project launched on Cassandra's timeline, something would break. The only question was what, and who would bear responsibility. The following week brought the first signs of friction. Cassandra scheduled a kickoff meeting with the development team, outlining workstreams and deliverables. The developers listened politely, then began asking questions about dependency sequencing and integration testing windows. Cassandra's answers were conceptual rather than technical, focusing on desired outcomes instead of implementation mechanics. "We'll solve those challenges as we progress," she said, her tone suggesting that concerns about details betrayed a lack of innovative thinking. The lead developer, Tasha Freeman, persisted. "The legacy system integration alone requires 6 weeks of testing before we can deploy to production. That's not negotiable, it's contractual with our financial services clients." Cassandra glanced at Dominic, who'd been observing from the back of the room. He stepped forward smoothly. "Tasha, I appreciate the concern, but we're operating under a new paradigm here. Traditional timelines assume traditional approaches. We're being more agile." Tasha's expression suggested she understood that agile was being used as a synonym for faster rather than its actual methodology, but she didn't argue further. After the meeting, she found me in the hallway. "This is going to fail," she said quietly. "Document everything," I told her. "Every resource constraint, every timeline conflict. Normal project management." She understood. We were building a record, not staging a rebellion. 2 days later, Dominic sent an email to division leadership announcing that Cassandra would be presenting Titan Project to the board of directors at their quarterly meeting in 3 weeks. The email praised her strategic leadership and noted that this presentation represented Capricorn's commitment to transformation. I read the email twice, then opened my saved documentation folder. The pattern was becoming clear. Dominic had invested his credibility in Cassandra's vision, and the board presentation would cement that investment publicly. If Titan Project succeeded, they'd both be credited as transformational leaders. If it failed, the question of accountability would become urgent. I added the board presentation announcement to my timeline document, which now tracked every major decision point and communication about the project. Not because I planned to deploy this information aggressively, but because institutional memory mattered when narratives got rewritten. The next 2 weeks accelerated. Cassandra pushed for visible progress ahead of the board presentation, prototype demonstrations, client interest surveys, partnership announcements that signaled momentum. Each initiative required resources my team was supposed to provide while simultaneously maintaining existing obligations. Foster escalated twice, formally requesting either additional headcount or permission to delay non-critical projects. Both requests were denied. Dominic's response emphasized the importance of supporting strategic priorities and suggested that Foster's concerns reflected capacity mindset rather than capability mindset. I watched my team stretch thinner. Tasha worked 70-hour weeks trying to parallel path development workstreams that should have been sequential. The client services team fielded increasingly anxious questions from enterprise accounts who'd heard rumors about platform changes but hadn't received official communications about transition planning. I continued documenting every resource request denial, every timeline conflict, every client concern that went unaddressed while leadership focused on board presentation optics. The board meeting happened on a Wednesday morning. I wasn't invited to attend, but the aftermath rippled through the office by lunchtime. Cassandra's presentation had apparently been well received, enthusiastic questions about market positioning, competitive advantage, revenue projections. The board authorized moving forward with full implementation. Dominic sent a congratulatory email to the entire division, praising Cassandra's masterful articulation of Capricorn's future and noting that board approval represented institutional validation of the new strategic direction. That afternoon, my calendar pinged with a meeting invitation from Cassandra, Titan Project, Implementation Acceleration. The invitation included Dominic and several other division directors. I accepted and began preparing talking points about resource constraints and client readiness protocols. The meeting opened with Cassandra reviewing the board's enthusiastic response. "They want to see results fast," she said. "We need to compress the timeline, initial deployment in 6 weeks instead of 12. The room went silent. 6 weeks meant bypassing most quality assurance protocols, eliminating buffer time for complications, and essentially guaranteeing that something would break in production. "That timeline doesn't accommodate client preparation," I said, keeping my voice level. "Our enterprise accounts need notification and technical readiness assessments before major platform changes." Cassandra's smile remained fixed. "We'll communicate as we build. Clients will adapt once they see the value proposition. Contractually, we're required to provide 90 days notice for material platform changes to financial services clients," I continued. "That's not a preference, it's a regulatory requirement tied to their compliance obligations." Dominic interjected. "Anita, I understand you're focused on process, but this is exactly the kind of traditional thinking that holds organizations back. The board wants bold action." "The board wants successful outcomes," I replied. "Bold action that violates client contracts produces lawsuits, not success." The meeting concluded tensely. Cassandra committed to the accelerated timeline despite the objections. Dominic backed her publicly. I returned to my office and sent Walter a brief email noting the timeline compression and flagging the regulatory compliance concerns. No dramatic language, just facts. Walter's response came within an hour: "Let's discuss tomorrow morning." That evening, I stayed late organizing my documentation. The folder now contained emails, meeting notes, resource allocation analyses, and a detailed timeline showing how the Titan project had evolved from ambitious to reckless. I wasn't planning to deploy this as a weapon, I was preparing for the inevitable moment when someone would ask what went wrong and why no one had warned them. The next morning's meeting with Walter was brief. He'd reviewed my earlier memo and compared it to the current implementation plan. The gap was obvious. "When did the timeline compress?" he asked. "Yesterday's meeting." Cassandra proposed 6 weeks to initial deployment, citing board enthusiasm. Walter's jaw tightened slightly. "And Dominic supported this?" "Yes." He characterized concerns about client contracts and regulatory requirements as traditional thinking. Walter made notes, then looked up. "Continue normal operations. If you receive directives that conflict with contractual or regulatory obligations, escalate to me immediately." I nodded and left. The pieces were positioning themselves. The next week brought chaos disguised as urgency. Cassandra launched a war room approach, with daily stand-ups and visible progress tracking. She positioned the compressed timeline as a test of Capricorn's operational excellence, a chance to demonstrate capability under pressure. My team tried to execute while flagging the mounting problems. Testing protocols were abbreviated. Client notifications were delayed while Cassandra refined messaging. Integration challenges that should have been solved before deployment were marked as post-launch optimization opportunities. I documented every shortcut, every skipped protocol, every warning that went unheeded. Not gleefully, this wasn't entertainment. People's work was being devalued, and the company's reputation was at risk. On a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the board presentation, I arrived to find my office phone ringing. Foster's voice was tight. "We've got a problem. The prototype deployment to our test environment crashed the legacy integration layer." I closed my eyes. How bad? Complete failure. Nothing's talking to anything. If this had happened in production, we'd have taken down client systems. Meeting in 10 minutes. Conference room B. I gathered Tasha and the senior technical leads. The prototype had exposed exactly the integration incompatibilities I'd flagged in my original feasibility analysis, the ones Cassandra's plan had dismissed as solvable during implementation. The team had discovered them now, weeks into development, with deployment supposedly 6 days away. Can it be fixed? I asked. Tasha shook her head. Not without rebuilding the integration architecture. We're talking months, not days. I pulled out my phone and called Walter. We need to talk about Titan Project. There's been a critical failure in testing. His response was immediate. My office. 30 minutes. Bring technical details. I assembled the documentation, test logs, failure analysis, the original feasibility study showing predicted integration challenges. Tasha came with me, bringing additional technical evidence. Walter listened to our presentation without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer as we detailed the scope of the failure. When we finished, he picked up his phone and called Dominic. My office. Now. Bring Cassandra. They arrived 15 minutes later, Dominic's confidence stride faltering slightly when he saw me and Tasha already seated with documentation spread across Walter's conference table. We've had a significant technical failure in Titan Project testing, Walter began. Anita's team has documented the details. I'd like to understand how we reached this point. Cassandra leaned forward. This is a normal part of iterative development. We'll solve it and move forward. The prototype crashed the entire integration layer, Tasha said flatly. It's not a minor bug. It's a fundamental architecture incompatibility. Dominic's expression hardened. This sounds like an execution problem, not a planning problem. I opened my laptop and projected the original feasibility analysis onto Walter's screen. I documented this exact risk 4 months ago. The integration constraints weren't hypothetical, they're structural limitations of our existing client systems. Cassandra's composure cracked slightly. That analysis was outdated. We're pursuing a more innovative approach. Innovation doesn't override physics, Tasha replied. The legacy systems can't support the proposed architecture without extensive modification. That's not a philosophical position, it's technical reality. Walter held up a hand. How long to fix this properly? 6 months minimum, Tasha said. That includes proper testing and client preparation. Dominic's face flushed. That timeline is unacceptable. The board expects results. The board expects functional solutions, Walter corrected. Not rushed deployments that crash client systems. He turned to me. Did you communicate these concerns through appropriate channels? I pulled up my email archive. Initial feasibility analysis submitted 4 months ago. Follow-up memo to you 6 weeks ago detailing regulatory and technical constraints. Multiple escalations from my team about resource conflicts and timeline risks. Walter scrolled through the documentation, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked at Dominic. Why wasn't this information incorporated into planning? Dominic's confidence wavered. We believed the concerns were overly conservative. Cassandra's approach was designed to transcend traditional limitations. You can't transcend client contracts through optimism, Walter said coldly. We're pausing Titan Project pending a complete technical and regulatory review. Anita, your team will lead the assessment. Dominic, Cassandra, you'll provide full cooperation. The room felt airless. Cassandra's face had gone pale, while Dominic looked like he was calculating how to reframe the disaster as someone else's failure. We were following your directive for bold innovation, Dominic tried. Walter's voice dropped to a tone I'd never heard from him before. Bold innovation that ignores documented risks isn't leadership, it's negligence. This meeting is over. We filed out silently. As I walked back to my office, I felt the weight of what had just shifted. Not triumph, there was no victory in watching a project fail. But there was recognition that the institutional knowledge I'd preserved had mattered when it counted. The next morning, I received a calendar invitation from Walter. Titan Project Recovery Planning, you're leading the assessment. The recovery phase revealed just how close we'd come to catastrophe. As my team conducted the comprehensive technical audit, we discovered that 3 major enterprise clients, representing combined annual revenue of $40 million, had been preparing to invoke termination clauses due to inadequate communication about platform changes. Their legal teams had drafted notices, waiting only for official deployment announcements before filing. I spent 2 days on calls with each client's technical leadership, walking them through the revised approach. These weren't apology tours, they were credibility restoration exercises. I showed them our detailed implementation plan, explained how we'd identified and addressed integration risks, and provided transparent timelines that included buffer periods for complications. "This is what we expected from the beginning," one CTO told me. "Professional planning, not marketing presentations." The comment stung on behalf of the organization, but it validated the approach. Clients wanted competence, not charisma. They'd forgive cautious timelines far more readily than they'd forgive system failures that disrupted their operations. Foster worked alongside me throughout the audit, and one evening as we reviewed testing protocols, he said something that crystallized the entire situation. "You know what's interesting? Cassandra never once asked to shadow a client implementation. She wanted to design systems without understanding how they'd actually be used." He was right. Vision without ground truth wasn't innovation, it was guesswork with better vocabulary. The technical assessment I submitted ran 47 pages, documenting every shortcut, every skipped protocol, every incompatibility that rushed planning had ignored. The final recommendation, 14 months for proper implementation, with mandatory client preparation phases and regulatory compliance validation at each stage. Walter didn't just accept the timeline, he had it printed and distributed to every member of the leadership team, along with a cover memo establishing new requirements for strategic initiative approval. No more bypassing operational feasibility reviews. No more conflating urgency with importance. The board meeting where Walter presented these findings lasted 3 hours. I wasn't in the room, but the outcomes rippled through the organization within days. 2 board members requested one-on-one briefings with me about operational governance. The CEO sent a company-wide message emphasizing that Capricorn's reputation depended on delivering excellence, not just promising it. Cassandra cleaned out her desk on a Friday afternoon. I watched from my office window as she carried a small box to her car, her movements quick and angular. Part of me felt sympathy, she'd been elevated too quickly, given responsibility without mentorship, encouraged to prioritize presentation over substance. But another part recognized that she'd dismissed legitimate concerns as obstacles rather than engaging with them as information. The organizational chart reorganization happened the following Monday. My new title came with expanded responsibilities, oversight of both strategic planning and implementation execution, with direct reporting to Walter. The position effectively made me the bridge between vision and reality, the translator who ensured bold ideas could survive contact with operational constraints. Walter presented the findings to the board at their next meeting. Cassandra was reassigned to a research role with no direct reports. Dominic remained as VP but with significantly reduced autonomy. Every strategic initiative now required operational feasibility review before resource commitment. On my first day in the new role, Dominic stopped by my office. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something more cautious, a wariness in how he positioned himself in the doorway rather than striding in. "Congratulations on the promotion," he said. I nodded acknowledgement. "Thank you." He hesitated, and I could see him choosing words carefully. I underestimated the importance of institutional knowledge. "We all have different strengths," I replied diplomatically. "The goal is serving the organization effectively." I suppose I was focused on making an impact quickly. His voice carried a defensiveness that hadn't been there before. "Impact requires foundation," I said. "Bold moves need structural support, or they collapse." He nodded, seeming to understand that this wasn't just professional advice but a postmortem on his tenure. The swagger that had once characterized his every movement was gone, replaced by the careful positioning of someone who'd learned that confidence without competence was temporary. Over the following months, I watched Dominic's role gradually diminish. He attended meetings but rarely drove decisions. His pronouncements about innovation and disruption became fewer, replaced by questions about feasibility and risk assessment. He'd learned to ask rather than declare, but the lesson had come at the cost of his reputation. Tasha told me months later that Dominic had approached her team asking to shadow a technical implementation cycle. He wanted to understand what he'd missed, she said. I almost respected that, except he should have done it before making promises to the board. The attempt at remediation came too late. 6 months after the Titan project collapse, Dominic accepted a position at another firm, announced as a mutual decision that everyone understood meant managed departure. His farewell email spoke of exciting new challenges and opportunities for fresh impact, language that masked the reality of diminished standing. I turned back to my computer, where a revised Titan project plan waited, built on realistic timelines, validated assumptions, and work that could actually be sustained. The lesson wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about the gap between confidence and competence, between vision and execution. In corporate environments, the loudest voice often wins the room. But when systems fail and consequences arrive, it's the documented warnings and preserved institutional knowledge that decide who was right. I'd been excluded from strategy sessions because I represented process over inspiration, discipline over disruption. But when inspiration collided with reality, process was what rebuilt trust and restored function. The rebuilt Titan project launched 18 months later, thoroughly tested and fully prepared. Client adoption exceeded projections because we invested in readiness instead of hype. The board praised the execution, and Capricorn's reputation for reliable innovation strengthened instead of eroding under broken promises. I still work at Capricorn, now reporting directly to Walter. My office has a better view, and my calendar includes the strategy sessions I was once barred from. But the real change is cultural. Bold ideas now require operational validation before becoming commitments. The first strategy session I led felt like vindication without gloating. We reviewed an ambitious expansion proposal. I asked about regulatory exposure, resource strain, client readiness. The questions weren't resisted, they were expected. Walter watched from the back of the room and later said, "Vision that respects constraints isn't limited thinking. It's sustainable growth." Dominic left for another company that prized confidence over caution. He didn't last long. Cassandra moved into consulting, where recommendations don't require follow-through. Years later, she admitted she'd confused being impressive with being thorough. I appreciated the honesty, even if it arrived late. At Capricorn, we formalized feasibility requirements for every strategic proposal. Some younger employees chafed, seeing process as obstruction. I understood, I once did too. But I'd also seen the wreckage when process was dismissed as antiquated thinking. My team has grown to 50 people across strategy, operations, and implementation. We've delivered 6 major initiatives on time and within scope. The secret isn't brilliance, it's discipline. Document assumptions, validate constraints, respect expertise. Being underestimated turned out to be an advantage. While others chased applause, I kept records. And when the prototype failed 2 days after I was cut from review, the difference between vision and viability became impossible to ignore.